Youth here acknowledges that today we gather on Gadigal country. We pay our respect to elders past and present, to the traditional custodians who have cared for country for thousands of years, and we extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us here tonight. We acknowledge their enduring connection to lands, waters, skies, and communities. These lands have provided a home for many searching for refuge and peace, including our Jewish communities. We walk together with respect and care on this land that sustains the spirit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and which now sustains us all.
We welcome the presidents of our partner organisations, David Ossip of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, Greg Shand of the Sydney Jewish Museum, Gillian Siegel AO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and Dr. George Foster, President of the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, otherwise known to me as POP.
Yom HaShoah is the International Day of Commemoration for the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe, and on Yom HaShoah we come together to reflect on the utter catastrophe endured by the Jewish people at the hands of the Nazi regime. This year marks 5 years since we started Youth Here, an organisation that is dedicated to mitigating hate in society by connecting young Australians with the memory of the Holocaust. We aim to provide a platform for young adults to engage in a way that remains meaningful and relevant, because never again means never forgetting. For the 78 years since the end of the Holocaust, survivors have carried the burden of memory for our community. As time passes, we confront a world where survivors are no longer able to tell their stories. It is now our collective responsibility to remember, to speak up, and to ensure that such atrocities truly never happen again. We extend a special thanks to you, our audience, for standing with us over the last 5 years, for strengthening our voice, our action, our reach, and our mission. Together, we can mitigate all forms of hate. We'll take one step at a time towards never again. Please rise for the Australian anthem led by Shuli Grauman.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage to advance Australia fair. In joyful strength, then let us see advance Australia fair.
People often confuse optimism and hope. They sound similar, but in fact they're very different. Optimism is the belief that things are going to get better. Hope is the belief that if we work hard enough together, we can make things better. It needs no courage, just a certain naivety to be an optimist. It needs a great deal of courage to have hope. No Jew, knowing what we do about history and our own past, so often written in tears, can be an optimist. But no Jew who is a true Jew can ever give up hope. And that is why Judaism is, for me, the voice of hope in the conversation of humankind. And hope is what transforms the human situation.
2 weeks ago, Jewish families came together for their Passover Seders. Around the table, they shared a story. The story of the birth of the Jewish nation. Around the world, the story was passed from parent to child. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, they explained, but God took us out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. When the Jews left Egypt, escaping into the desert with only the clothes on their back, this was not an act of blind optimism. Through great confusion and tribulation, the Jewish people persevered, sustained by their hope that a better future awaited them. The thousands of years of Jewish history that followed are littered with periods of great joy and great suffering. Through it all, the constant has been hope. Hope that a fragile peace will persist. Hope that things aren't as bad as they seem. Hope that from devastation can come salvation, and hope when all hope seems lost.
As long as the heart within the Jewish soul yearns, and towards the eastern edges onwards, an eye gazes towards Zion, our hope is not yet lost. The hope that 2,000 years old, to be a free nation in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem.
Written in the late 19th century by Jewish poet Naftali Herz Imber, the poem we just read was originally called Tikvatenu, our hope in Hebrew. Later, we would come to know it as Hatikvah, or the Hope, the national anthem of the State of Israel. Despite what it would become, at the time of writing, the idea of a Jewish homeland was a fantasy. The poem was a product of yet another moment of increasing confusion and tribulation in the history of the Jewish people. For hundreds of years, Jews had enjoyed relative peace and security in the diaspora. There was no one way to be a Jew. They were traditional and modern, orthodox and progressive, and every shade in between. Many Jews enjoyed successful and prosperous lives with a strong sense of cultural identity. Jewish families often lived in close-knit communities and were also active in political and social movements, working to advance the rights and opportunities for all. They were Nobel Prize winners, tailors, and tradesmen. They were wealthy, and they were so poor that they couldn't afford shoes and coats for their children in the winter. They went to religious schools, they prayed at local synagogues, but they also went to the movies, played sports, and assimilated into secular society. The Jewish world was creative and complex, a rich mosaic characterized by diversity, resilience, and a strong commitment to one another. As the years passed, the political climate in Europe began to intensify, with violent pogroms and state-sanctioned discrimination becoming a feature of everyday life. A renewed yearning for Jewish safety was ignited. Imber's poem took on a new meaning. The Jewish people needed to flee, and fast. The idealistic fantasy was suddenly a pressing necessity.
The rise of the Nazi Party in Germany saw the rich mosaic that once flourished begin to crumble. The Nazi regime promoted a virulent form of anti-Semitism that demonized and dehumanized Jews. Jews were gradually excluded from many aspects of society, including schools and workplaces. Stripped of their citizenship and many of their basic rights, Jews could no longer own property, work in certain professions, and marry non-Jewish Germans. They were betrayed by their once trusted neighbors who reported them to Nazi authorities. Being Jewish was no longer a cultural and religious identity. It was a crime punishable by death. In the shadow of an oppressive regime, with the specter of death looming, Jews refused to give up the hope that had sustained them from their days in the desert. A long history of persecution had taught Jews to be careful. During the festival of Hanukkah, Jews are supposed to light the candles of the menorah in public for all to see. In times of danger, however, the menorah may be lit in the privacy of the home. In 1932, the Posner family were confronted by the sight of a Nazi swastika each time they looked out of their window. When it came time to light the Hanukkah candles, they refused to be intimidated. In the face of mortal danger, the Posner family set their menorah on their windowsill. Struck by the contrast between the light in their home and the darkness outside, Mrs. Posner took a photograph. On the back of the photograph, she wrote a message. "Death to Judah," so the flag says. "Judah will live forever," so the light answers.
On the 2nd of August, 1941, SS Commander Heinrich Himmler formally received approval from the Nazi Party to implement the final solution to the Jewish question. Jews from across Europe were rounded up and deported to concentration and extermination camps. The camps were designed to imprison, torture, and kill millions of Jews and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazis. The living conditions in these camps were inhumane. Prisoners were subjected to starvation, disease, and brutal physical and psychological abuse. Millions of innocent people lost their lives. Philip Mueller was born in the town of Sered in Slovakia to a Jewish family in 1922. At the age of 20, Philip was deported to Auschwitz concentration camp. In Auschwitz, he was forced to work in the crematoria and gas chambers as part of a Jewish group of prisoners known as the Sonderkommando.
Then suddenly they got off the truck and the SS was beating these people. When they were in the undressing room, I was at the back door of the undressing room and was able to see this terrible scene. The people were bleeding. Now they knew where they were. They looked at the columns of the so-called International Information Center. They were in such a state of terror, and this sight didn't calm them. On the contrary, it put them into such a state of terror because they already knew and had heard what happened there. They were desperate. Children clung to each other, daughters, mothers, parents, older people were crying. They were distraught. Suddenly you could see that several SS officers were coming down the stairs. Among others, the head of the camp, Schwarzhuber, who had promised them earlier that they would be taken to Heidenbeck. Then I saw how they started to scream, plead. Heidenbeck was a lie. We were lied to. We want to live. We want to work. And they were looking into the face of the SS executioner, but they didn't care. They just watched, when suddenly a group revolted. Probably they wanted to confront the henchmen, the SS henchmen, and tell them how they had been lied to. In the undressing room, there was an extraordinary level of violence, which these people were then forced to undress. Some got undressed, but only a very small number. The majority didn't obey this order. Suddenly, a voice began to sing. Others joined in, and the sound swelled into a mighty choir. It started like a choir singing. Singing spread through the undressing room, and then it became clear they were singing the Czech national anthem, and then the Hatikvah. It was as if they regarded the singing as a last kind of protest, which they were determined to stifle if they could. To be allowed to die together was the only comfort these people had left. Singing their national anthem, they were saying a last farewell to their brief but flourishing past. I was very moved by this act of my people, and I was overcome. My life had no value. My life for what? And then I went into the gas chamber with them and decided to die. Then suddenly several people who recognized me because I had been in the camp several times with my friends, they came to me, looked at me and said, "That makes no sense. You want to die? That makes no sense. Your dying will not keep us alive. That is no feat. You have to get out of here. You have to tell them about our suffering and the injustice done to us." Singing Hatikvah in the face of certain death, Jews were sustained by the power of hope. The hope that they would be remembered, the hope that the Nazis would not succeed, and the hope that the Jewish story would live on in survivors like Philip. Accompanying Philip's testimony tonight was a rendition of the Hatikvah performed by Ben Adler on the violin of Emanuel Fischer. Emanuel was a German Jew who played in the Weintraub Syncopators, a successful European band. He fled Germany in the 1930s and eventually made his way to Australia. Emanuel survived, and so did his violin, and we are privileged to have it heard played this evening.
The hope of many who lost their lives during the Holocaust was that there would be survivors to serve as their legacy, in whose stories they would always live on. It is our privilege to have Holocaust survivor Peter Hallis here with us tonight to share his story of survival.
Good evening. My name is Peter Hallis, and I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1939, about a month after World War II started. My family was a middle-class Jewish family. My mother's father owned an oriental carpet business, and he was quite wealthy. My father's father was a headmaster in a primary school. Life was quite normal, despite a war going on, as Hungary, being an ally of the Germans, weren't occupied, and the Jews were left alone. We lived on the high side, the Buddha side of the city, in a nice apartment. My father worked for his father-in-law in his shop. Life seemed normal. In 1942, my father, with his two brothers, were sent to Soviet Union in a labor battalion. The conditions were dreadful. The cold reached -25, -30 centigrade. Under these conditions, the Jewish laborers dropped like flies. My father was given a truck to drive, and sitting in the cabin of the truck, instead of working outdoors, saved his life. His two brothers both died of exposure. However, in Budapest, life was still quite normal, until 19th of March 1944. The Germans entered the country retreating from the Soviet Union after their defeat at Stalingrad, and on occupying the country, they started to deport the Jews to concentration camps, mostly to Auschwitz. In a matter of a few months, they deported close to 600,000 Jews, most of whom were murdered. The penny dropped for my grandfather that he and his family must hide if they want to survive. My mother and I found safety with an Armenian family. They took huge personal risk in hiding us, but they went through the Armenian Holocaust at the hands of Turkey, and they knew the dangers we faced, ignoring the fact that if we were found hiding with them, they would have been killed alongside us. Life was difficult. We couldn't leave our small room. Food was short, and we worried every time we heard a knock on the door or a car stopping in front of our building. My grandparents hid in someone else's apartment. Life went along until 15th of December, my grandfather's birthday. My mother couldn't let the day go by without seeing him, and despite the risks, she kissed me goodbye and left. That was the last time I saw her. While she visited her father, the Hungarian Nazis, the Nyilas, raided the building where they hid, collected all the people, marched them through the streets of Budapest to the banks of the Danube River, lined them up and shot them all. There's a monument of shoes made of brass at the very spot along the riverbank where the shooting took place, commemorating the victims who were killed there. It is estimated that up to 30,000 Jews were killed. When we learned what had happened, my host got worried in case we are next targeted. The following morning, my host put me on his shoulder and started to walk to find somewhere safe for me to stay. Everything was happening fast. I had no time to grieve or even come to terms with my mother's death. After walking a long time, we arrived at the outskirts of the city and met a couple who had no children and were prepared to take me in. Budapest was under siege. The Americans were bombing the city, the Soviets were fighting the Germans and Hungarian Nazis on the ground. During the bombing raids, we rushed into a cellar hoping that the house above won't collapse on top of us if it gets hit. Mid-February, Budapest was liberated and we were free. The whole city was destroyed. Hardly a building survived intact. If you've seen the bomb buildings in the Ukraine on TV recently, then that is how Budapest looked. But we survived. The couple looking after me wanted to adopt me. However, my grandmother, my father's mother, survived in the Budapest ghetto, and somehow she found me and came to claim me. There was an enormous fight between her and my hosts, but she was a strong woman. She said, as far as I know, Peter is the only surviving member of my family. I'm taking him with me, and that was that. I went to live with her and my grandfather. I can't even imagine how my grandparents and all the other survivors of the war and the Holocaust felt. 2 of my grandparents' sons were killed in the most horrible circumstances. One of my uncles had a wife and a son. They were all dead. My grandmother couldn't even find out where they were buried and how her sons, her daughter-in-law and grandson died. There were people looking for their relatives everywhere. People used to go to the railway stations, meeting incoming trains, bringing people back from the camps to see if the relation was amongst the returning people. The people returning were emaciated, sick, and in terrible mental state. There was no support for survivors. They just had to get on with life as best as they could. Slowly, life was returning to Budapest. They cleared away the rubble, and the rebuilding started. Around June, there was a knock on the door, and when we opened it, my father stood there. He was very thin and quite sick, but alive. After my grandmother took charge of him, he regained his health and eventually reopened my grandfather's business, and life became normal, a new normal. Eventually, my father found a new partner who became my stepmother. She loved me, and I got to love her. A year or so later, my brother Andrew was born. Hungary was free for a very short few years. By 1950, the Soviets installed a communist government and were once again under a dictatorship. Life was again hard. Food disappeared, and were most times reduced to eating beans and potatoes. My father was accused of hoarding gold, which was an absolute lie, and jailed for 18 months. After the horror of the work camps of Russia, the horrors of Bergen-Belsen and concentration camps, the trauma of losing his wife, his brothers, and most of the rest of our family, he was again in jail. Things were tough for us too. My grandmother and my stepmother went to work in a factory to be able to provide for our little family. The country was sealed off from the West. No news either through the press or the radio was allowed from anywhere but the Soviet sources. You could not leave the country. The borders were sealed by electric wires and mines laid along the borders. In October 1956, the political situation boiled over and the revolution broke out. Whilst it was swiftly put down, it allowed for the electric wires and mines to be picked up, and people started to stream out of the country. I left with 4 friends, mostly walking at night to the border of Hungary and Austria. We crossed the border on the 28th of November 1956. You cannot imagine the relief and happiness we felt on reaching a Western country. The Red Cross looked after us initially. We were housed in army barracks and fed. When I was asked where I wanted to go, as staying in Austria was not an option, I replied that after surviving the Holocaust, World War II, the communist dictatorship, revolution, I wanted to get away from Europe as far as I could. They said, Australia is the place you want to go to. It took 7 months to organize my immigration and transport. We left in May 1957 from Marseille in a decommissioned US naval boat, the General Harry Taylor. We arrived in June. Sydney was at its best. Brilliant sunshine, quite warm in the middle of winter. I was in heaven. I worked on the ship as a cleaner, so I arrived with $90 US, which was a fortune in 1957. Friends of my parents were already here established, and they gave me a hand finding accommodation and a job. I enrolled in evening English course, and within about 3 months I could make myself understood. At first I worked at whatever I could make a living. I was a laborer in a storeroom, I washed dishes in a hotel, I worked in a car factory, I sold office equipment, eventually finding that the clothing industry was my shtick. I worked as a salesman and started to make some good money. Around this time, I met Yvonne. I was 21, Yvonne was 18. We fell in love, and despite her parents' doubts, we got married in December 1960. We had 2 children, Simon and Anthony, and life was good. Eventually, we decided to start our own business and established a swimwear business called Seafolly. After years of hard work, the business was a success. Simon and Anthony grew up, got married to wonderful partners, and became parents of their own. And we now have 6 wonderful grandchildren, aged from 17 to 31, and we are waiting for our first great-grandchild. So after a very iffy start, my life turned out okay, but it nearly didn't. I survived through sheer luck. I'm missing my mother every day. There isn't a day that I don't think of her and my grandparents. I imagine their final walk to the Danube with rough Hungarian Nazis abusing them and knowing that their march will probably end in their death. How did my grandfather feel knowing that a few years earlier he had a chance to save himself and his family if he would have left? My mother thinking of me all alone at age 5, wondering what will become of me. My story is not unique. There are 6 million Jews that we mourn today during Yom HaShoah, and we who survived cannot stop mourning them. Their memory lives within us, and those who follow us are children and grandchildren.
Peter, we are so grateful to you for sharing your story with us. Thank you.
Sure.
In honor of those whose memory Philip carried from Auschwitz, in honor of Peter's family, in honor of the mothers and daughters, fathers and sons whose lives were lost, in honor of the 6 million, we now invite Rabbi Shua Solomon to join Peter and recite the memorial prayer. Please stand.
אל מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. את נשמות 6 מיליון אחינו ואחיותינו שנהרגו על קידוש השם. אנא בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרו בצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
In the early hours of an April morning in 1944, at the age of 16, Edith Eger and her family, along with all the Jews in their town of Košice, were rounded up and imprisoned in a brick factory on the outskirts of their town. A few weeks later, they were loaded into a cattle car bound for Auschwitz. Edith's parents were killed in the gas chambers on the day of their arrival. Dr. Eger recounts that each moment in Auschwitz was nothing short of hell on earth. Yet, amidst the unspeakable suffering and constant uncertainty, she found her greatest teacher. It was here that she learned how to choose hope in the face of unimaginable fear and turmoil. When the hopelessness threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the words her mother had spoken to her in the suffocating cattle car on their way to Auschwitz. We don't know what lies ahead, but remember, no one can take away what you've put in your mind. During the endless days and nights of imprisonment, Edith carefully chose which thought to hold on to. She thought of Eric, the boy she had fallen in love with amidst the chaos of war. She remembered their picnics by the river, enjoying her mother's homemade fried chicken and potato salad, dreaming of a future together. She imagined their reunion, the embrace of two people who had endured so much and yet found each other once again. Daydreaming of Eric did not ease the horror of Auschwitz, nor could it bring back her parents or ease the pain of their loss. But it allowed Edith to envision a future beyond starvation and torture. She knew that she was living through hell, but that it was temporary. If it was temporary, there was hope. Each moment is a choice, she would later teach. No matter how frustrating or boring or constraining or painful or oppressive our experience, we can always choose how we respond. Olga Horak survived, and with that, she made the choice to hold on to hope.
I was a young teenager when things happened in a most drastic manner. Well, my background is from Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist anymore. As a young girl, I was only 14 years old. I couldn't continue my schooling, and that affects you for the rest of the life. You know, I feel I was robbed of my childhood, the best years in my life. The first transport actually collecting Jewish people started in 42. I had a sister who was 16 years old at the time when a law came in effect that all 16 years old Jewish girls in March 1942 will be collected and taken away. Now, first of all, we never heard of that word, collecting people. Well, we don't collect people, we collect items, if you like to collect art or any other stamps, but not people. We never saw her, we never heard of her again, never. Anyhow, you know, that was a horrible thing to happen. That my family was, of course, heartbroken. My mother and my father wanted to protect me because I could have been shortly after on a different list. So we left and we crossed the border to Hungary. We had nowhere to stay. We changed places every 2 or 3 days in horrible rented rooms in slum areas. So, you know, when the situation became dangerous, because anybody could have denounced us in the street, recognizing us, my father decided we return home. We returned home again illegally, crossing the border during the night, and we came home, but our home was occupied by strangers. Every room was occupied with different people. We had nowhere to go. But my mom had a very near friend who was our neighbor, and she offered us a hiding place.
Having been offered a sanctuary where they felt they would be safe, this reality was quickly shattered. The supposed friend hiding Olga and her family turned them in to the Nazi authorities. Olga and her parents were marched to the railway line and then crammed into primitive, filthy cattle cars packed with hundreds of people where they were transported to Auschwitz. She was devastatingly separated from her father, never seeing him again. However, comforted by the presence of her mother, Olga went on. At their arrival to the death camp, she and her mother were selected by Joseph Mengele, a notorious and eternally feared Nazi doctor who performed horrific medical experiments on victims at the Auschwitz death camps. Then they were taken to be stripped, shaven, numbered, and given old rags to wear. Demoralized, humiliated, hungry, and fearing for survival each minute, the months ahead were grueling and almost insurmountable. In the winter of 1944, Olga and her mother were forced to endure a death march, exposed to the freezing cold with no food or warm clothes. Death marches were common towards the end of the war when the Nazis felt the Allies on their heels and were determined to complete their mission of genocide and hide the evidence. Despite the impossible conditions on the march of hundreds of kilometers, Olga and her mother made it to the next torturous location. Their arrival at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was a living nightmare. Mountains of dead bodies confronted their eyes, while the overwhelming stench of burning flesh affronted their noses. Yet even in the face of such horror, Olga never lost her will to survive. She was liberated by the Allies in April 1945, with her mother tragically passing away moments after. Although Olga lost her main source of hope, she did not give up on her own will to survive. Olga was taken to a German hospital weighing just 29 kilograms, but her mind was sharp.
One morning, there was a Catholic priest from the British Army in full uniform visiting the sick in the hospital. That's what they do. And they saw me in the far corner, a bundle of bones, skeleton, and he came to me. And he had a big crucifix in his hand, and he had a prayer book in his hand, and a prayer shawl. And he came to my bed, and he made like this. He said, "My dear girl, I'm giving you now the last rites." I spoke English, and I could understand and converse with him. And I looked at him and I said, "Thank you very much, Padre. You can't give me the last rites, because I'm Jewish and I'm not going to die."
Olga's strength is inspiring. She lost everything and everyone who was important to her, yet she retained her fierce passion to live. After the war, Olga moved to Australia, and there her new life began.
My only hope was, after the war, to find a soulmate, which I did, luckily. To create a new family. I hoped it would be possible. After the sicknesses I endured and the horrible times I endured, physically and mentally, I still hoped that I can create a family, which I did. And that it wasn't easy in a country which was far away from my home, very far away. I would have never dreamt to come to Australia, never. We started our Jewish Association for Holocaust Survivors, and we had a dream to have a museum one day. And the dream became reality due to the fact that we have a wonderful charitable person like John Saunders, who was a survivor, and he knew what the need was for. The need for a museum to have a documentation for the rest of when we won't be here anymore. Of course, I won't be here, but the museum hopefully will be here for many more years. But of course, hope is a very, very strong word. But don't give it up, ever.
As time passes, the number of Holocaust survivors remaining with us dwindles. We are so fortunate and honored to have Olga present here with us today. Thank you for being with us and sharing your story, Olga.
Judaism said no. It isn't true. Fate isn't final. The decree has not been sealed. God has given us the one gift that redeems life from tragedy, the gift of freedom. We can choose, we can change, we can act differently next time. We can make sure that the future isn't an endless replay of the past. And as for the past, if we acknowledge it, God forgives. Out of that faith came the one word with the power to redeem life from tragedy. The word Hatikvah, hope. Jews lost many things in the course of history. Their land, their home, their city Jerusalem, their Holy of Holies, the temple. Sometimes they lost their lives, but never did they lose their hope. Jews kept hope alive, and hope kept the Jewish people alive.
The descendants of Holocaust survivors are a living testament to the unyielding human spirit, one that has overcome unimaginable horror and emerged stronger and more determined than ever. They are the hope of their ancestors made real. Descendants of Holocaust survivors carry with them a weighty inheritance, the indelible memory of the atrocities committed against their forebears during one of the darkest periods in human history. Yet, this inheritance is also a source of strength and resilience. The legacy of their families and communities serves as a crucial reminder of the evils of hatred, bigotry, and intolerance. By preserving the memory of the Holocaust, descendants can ensure that the lessons of this cataclysmic event are never forgotten, and that the world commits to learning the lessons of the past to ensure that such hatred and destruction does not happen again. In the Jewish tradition, the flame of a candle is thought to represent the human soul. On Yom HaShoah, we light candles for those who had their lives stolen from them. In the words of Dr. Edith Eger, we cannot choose to vanish the dark, but we can choose to kindle the light. Tonight, 6 descendants of Holocaust survivors will light 6 candles.
My grandmother, Yvonne Engelman, was born in a little town in Czechoslovakia called Dovhe on the 9th of October, 1927. She was an only child and was blessed with many friends during her time at school. When she was a young girl, Nanny, along with the other Jewish children, were removed from the education system, with her acclaimed friends becoming hostile, completely ignoring her. Even today, Nanny still remembers that hurt. Nanny was taken to the Berehovo ghetto in Hungary before being transported by cattle car, with the final destination, Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was during this week-long journey where a conversation with her father gave her the hope and determination to survive. Her father asked her to promise him that she will survive. At the time, Nanny had no idea what the promise meant, but she said yes. After arriving at Auschwitz, Dr. Mengele directed Nanny's parents and grandmother to the left, while she was sent to the right. This was the last time she ever saw them. The SS took her to a room where they shaved her head, took off her clothing, and finally to the showers, which was in fact a gas chamber. She was locked in there for the entire night before being marched out still alive in the morning, as the gas had not worked. After surviving the gas chamber, Nanny was made to work in the factory, searching the garments of the prisoners for any valuables they may have sewn into them, in the hope they'd be able to save something. Before Auschwitz was liberated, my grandmother was sent on a death march to Peterswalde, arriving in a less than survivable state. When she contracted scarlet fever, she had to hide it from the guards for fear of certain death. If not for the other girls in the factory who finished her quota and the one doctor who treated her, she would not be here. After the war was finished, Nanny made it to her hometown in hope that someone from her family would turn up, although no one ever did. Before moving to Australia, she met my grandfather in Czechoslovakia, who waited for Nanny in Sydney as he had arrived before her. They got married in 1949, becoming the first Holocaust survivors to get married in Australia. Hope and determination is what gave my grandmother the will to survive. As she puts it, they can do anything to you, but they cannot break your spirit. They never succeeded to break my spirit because I had a promise which I wanted to fulfill, a promise to my dad that I will survive, and I did. I remember sitting around my grandmother's Shabbat table with 4 generations of family, which began from Nanny, an only child, the sole survivor of her family. It is here where my grandmother's and grandfather's hope has been fulfilled. We look to the future, but never forget the past as we try to build a new life for us. Nanny has always taught us, never forget the past and never forget who you are, to be decent human beings, decent citizens of the world, and proud Jews of the world. Nan has and continues to share her story of strength and courage every week at the museum with the hope of inspiring a more tolerant and kind generation. It is my hope that by sharing her story that we can all focus on what connects us and create a more inclusive society for us all.
As a Jewish teen, not at a Jewish day school, I truly understand the importance of the Jewish youth being proud of our culture and having hope towards a more peaceful future, absent of anti-Semitism. When someone talks about Hatikvah, the first thing that comes to mind is entering Yad Vashem and watching the video of European youth proudly singing Hatikvah prior to the outbreak of the Holocaust. And thus, I see Hatikvah as more than just the national anthem of Israel, but an anthem for Jewish youth who are passionate about the future of the Jewish community. As a descendant of Holocaust survivors and victims, Hatikvah reminds me of the resilience of our community, that even through the worst atrocities, our community and culture will survive with a constant hope for a better future. Although personally, I was never able to meet any family members who experienced any part of the Holocaust, I have had the inspiring opportunity to hear from multiple Holocaust survivors as part of my involvement in the Sydney Jewish Museum Youth Committee. One of my clearest memories of an interaction with a Holocaust survivor at the museum was sitting on a panel with survivor Kitty Lowinger last year. I remember feeling so privileged to sit next to someone so incredible and hear her story. I remember feeling so inspired by both the strength and resilience of Kitty. The opportunity to hear the stories of Kitty and numerous other Holocaust survivors has reminded me of the importance of being grateful for what we have and doing whatever we, as the youth, can to contribute to a better future. It has reminded me of how lucky we are to live in Australia, in a society that, although far from perfect, allows its citizens freedom to express themselves in any way. We have been taught the importance of making the stories of these survivors timeless and had the opportunity to try out the newest technologies, including the Dimensions in Testimony, which has ensured that conversations with Holocaust survivors will be possible for generations.
My grandfather, Jano Kirschenbaum, grew up wanting to be a mechanical engineer like his father. When he was young, he was told instead that he would be a tailor, because during the war, the mechanical engineers went out onto the front to catch the bullets, while the tailors sat in warm rooms repairing uniforms. When war came, there was to be no warm room for him. There was a cattle car stacked with people. There were labour camps. There were death marches. Some days there were only the roots of the grass to eat. When he broke his arm between 2 trains, he had to hide it for fear of being seen as unable to work and marked for death. Being a tailor meant he could repair uniforms for favours. It was this that helped him survive. When the camps were liberated, Poppy moved to Budapest, where he met my grandmother and started a life with her. They left Europe after the outbreak of communism and came to Australia. They had little left of the life they were leaving behind and a small child. They didn't speak the language and they weren't sure what they would find here. It was hope that propelled them along, hope that by working hard they could make a life, hope that by moving to the other side of the world their family would be safe. I remember visiting my grandfather in his shop in Rushcutters Bay. It was there he made suits for prime ministers, mayors, doctors, lawyers. Of the 7 languages he spoke, I think English was the only one he learned by listening to the radio. 3 more sons came in Australia, including my dad. All 4 boys were taught that the path to safety lay in being a professional, in studying hard and making something of yourself. When I was 13, Poppy made me a suit for my bar mitzvah. Watching me at the bimah reading the Torah portion, his trademark grin shone on his face. His children and grandchildren represented his hope for the future realised, happy, healthy, and as safe as we could be as Jews in the diaspora. Poppy used to say, when he wasn't making a wisecrack or a quip, that everybody is a human being and everybody is a man. If he is Jewish or Christian or Muslim, if he is a good man, he is a good man. My hope for our future is that everyone learns and understands this. If a person who was betrayed so horribly by the world around him can trust in the goodness of others, then none of us have an excuse for baseless hatred or prejudice.
The story of my Safta, Judy Davis, is one that expresses the power of hope and the endurance of Jewish identity. As a sickly baby born towards the end of World War II in a shtetl in rural Hungary, she was taken by her mother to a Jewish hospital in Budapest. A nurse there had a cousin married to a righteous Gentile who smuggled my Safta out of the hospital before the patients were deported. They hid her along with other Jews and saved her life. Growing up, my Safta lived with whispers and did not know of her identity at all or the horrors that occurred during the war. It wasn't until she was around 18 years old that she discovered she was adopted. Despite the pain and confusion that came with this realization and being lied to her whole life, she was determined to learn more about her roots and uncover the truth about her past. The journey that followed was nearly 60 years of searching and longing. My grandmother's previously known name and birth date were made up, and there was no access to records, so despite some attempts, there was no real progress in finding out what happened to her family. In spite of no real exposure to Judaism in Hungary, my Safta never gave up hope and never wavered from her love of Judaism and connection to our people, which she sought out as she grew up as a teenager in Sydney. Fast forward, through the miraculous technology of DNA, with the combined effort of family as well as researchers from Hungary and DNA experts needing to test people in America, Canada, Hungary, London, and Israel, the truth was revealed. In August of 2018, at the age of 75, my Safta finally found out her real name, place of birth, the name of her parents, and that she had a half-brother who perished at Auschwitz at the age of 8. Along with her mother. Her mother was the youngest of 13 children, and only one of those siblings survived with his children and made Aliyah after the Shoah. In 2019, we went back with my Safta to Hungary, where we found a memorial with her family's name on it in the small country town where she was originally from. She also went to Israel, where she reunited with over 100 family members between both her mother and father's side, who she is now in regular contact with. This has meant the world to her. Each and every time our family talks or thinks about her story, we are continually struck by the incredible meaning that finding her family has brought her and the resilience and strength that she possessed in the face of such adversity. My Safta placing her Jewish identity at the forefront and creating a strong Jewish family out of the ashes of the Shoah is a testament to how the power of hope and belief can overcome even the most daunting of obstacles.
My grandfather Hans was born in Vienna. The youngest of 3 children, his earliest memories are of Nazi soldiers roaming the snow. When he was 4 or 5, they killed his new puppy with a bayonet. And suffice to say, my grandfather fared the worst of his siblings, for they remembered a life without fear and terror, but he did not. Hans nearly didn't make it out of Vienna alive. Sue, his sister, went to England, where she found refuge with peripheral members of the royal family. Harry, his brother, fled with their father to London, but their mother Beatrice could not find a way out for Hans. Desperate, she met with a gypsy fortune teller who said that a bus would stop on a street corner the next day at 4 o'clock. On that bus would be a man with false papers to smuggle my grandfather out of Austria. The next day, that bus arrived. On board was an old colleague of Hans's father who recognized him. Miraculously, the man managed to smuggle my grandfather out of Vienna into Italy, and from there, he made his way to Sydney. My grandfather's parents made it here too, but without any money, they placed him in an orphanage. So while the gas chambers swallowed Hans's grandparents, it was poverty that stole his childhood. My grandfather wasn't your prototypical Jewish student, at least not at first. At Sydney Grammar School, at the age of 10, his hands were already stained yellow with nicotine, and his mind was haunted by his neglect. Hans flunked school. He had to repeat year 12. And I know what you're wondering. Did he become a lawyer or a doctor in the end? Both, actually. My grandfather started as a school teacher, and from there he became a doctor, then a psychiatrist, later a lawyer and a barrister. He did it all. And ultimately Hans, who by that point went by Bob, pursued forensic psychiatry. The horrors of the Holocaust taught my grandfather resilience and radical compassion. So in his work, he sought to overcome trauma and fight for justice. My grandfather passed those passions onto me. Like him, I found myself orphaned before I'd finished school. And while I'm a third-generation Holocaust survivor, I'm also a survivor in the contemporary sense of the word. My grandfather understands loss, he understands trauma, he understands how human minds work, and like me, he has a dark sense of humor. So together we can talk about all things. Recently, he said to me, "You know, Ben, you made all of the suffering worth it." And the way that I interpret this is that despite all of the challenges, seeing me healthy and happy at a younger age gives my grandfather hope. It's the same hope that he fostered in me, and it goes to show that love is infinite. Given and received in equal measure over generations, love amplifies itself. Because love is more powerful than hate, love is eternal, and love is why we never forget. So I'm a documentary filmmaker, not a doctor, but my grandfather's past is already shaping my present and my future. I'm currently working on an SBS film about another remarkable Holocaust survivor story, and in May I'm going to start working with the Grace Tame Foundation, which aims to combat child abuse in all of its insidious forms. In many ways, I'm a man made in my grandfather's image, and all of us are lucky to be here today fighting for a better future because of our survivors' legacies.
For me, the Hatikvah epitomizes who we are as a people. Hopeful, optimistic, no matter what we are facing. My grandmother, my Buba, was a survivor of the Shoah. Buba was born in Poland, but was in France during the war. She endured a traumatic childhood that no one would wish upon their worst enemy. Buba, her sister and mother, had already experienced terrible poverty and anti-Semitism, but after the Nazis invaded France in 1940, life became even worse and more frightening. On the 16th of July, 1942, 13,000 Jews of Paris, men, women, and children, were rounded up and placed in the Velodrome de Ver, without food, water, or sanitation. Buba, her sister, and mother were amongst these people. From there, most of the Jews were deported to concentration camps in Poland, with very minimal survivors. However, Bubba, her mother and sister, were lucky enough to get out because of a work permit. They escaped to the French countryside and were hidden by 2 French families. In the depth of despair, there were still a few people that showed pure kindness. This gave my Bubba hope to continue and persevere in the most horrifying circumstances. My Bubba, her mother and sister moved to Australia in 1951. They started from absolutely nothing, but created a strong family here. The heroism and hope shown by these people who rescued my Bubba and her family has allowed our family to grow and flourish. All of Bubba's descendants are proud Jews and continue the tradition that she instilled in us, with some family now living in Israel. Despite the terrible trauma that she endured and continues to endure, she remains one of the most hopeful and optimistic people I know. Her unwavering hope has been instilled in my mother, her daughter, and then myself and my siblings. Bubba embodies the words of Hatikvah. Next month, my 94-year-old Bubba, all of her children and most grandchildren are traveling to France to meet the families who hid and saved her during the Shoah at the ceremony where they'll be recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. Nothing epitomizes the eternal hope of the Jewish people like this. Our unwavering hope and determination that the world can and will be a better place, and our faith in ourselves and those around us to help bring it about.
These candles honor the 1.5 million children lost in the Holocaust, the righteous among the nations who saved Jews in their moment of need, the survivors, the unknown, the loss of community, and all of the 6 million who lost their lives. Our candles also honor the Roma Sinti, the Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, people of color, the mentally and physically disabled. Please join us in a moment of silence. Just as man cannot live without hope, without dreams, he cannot live without hope. If dreams reflect the past, hope summons the future. Elie Wiesel. A powerful force that can guide us through the darkest of times, the fuel that ignites our spirits and dreams. Hope gives us the strength to persevere when all seems lost and inspires us to thrive for a better future. Hope is not just a feeling, it's a state of mind. Since the days of the Exodus from Egypt, the Jewish people have sustained hope, and hope has sustained the Jewish people. Hope is what motivates us to take action, to reach out to others, and to work for a better tomorrow. Hope, as Rabbi Sachs told us, is what transforms the human situation. In a world that can often seem dark and chaotic, hope is a beacon of light that can guide us through the storm. It is the promise of a brighter future and the people who make that future possible. Our hope, as we leave here tonight, is that these stories of hope help us learn from the lessons of the past, to be unyielding in the face of adversity, to be united in our struggle against intolerance and persecution. Our hope is that we can say never again and know it to be true.
Tonight, we perform our own rendition of Hatikvah. Let it be a reminder that those of us here, those with hope, can shine a light where darkness might otherwise flourish. To conclude our proceedings, please stand and join us.